I do hope you can see me today from where you are.
Ich bin ein Lehrling.
If I'm generally anything, I guess I'm generally miserable. This modern world of science and invention is of particular interest to women.
The people, I would say, there is no patent. Would you patent the sun?
I regard myself as a soldier, though a soldier of peace.
Welcome to the Biographers.
It's not something I don't get, mic shy necessarily. I just sometimes when I'm being too you and I have the same thing where it's just like, it's Akiva. He says stuff. And the second that I actually, on one hand, I should think about what I say. But on the other hand, when I do think about what I say too much, then I end up catching myself stuttering or like not feeling as loose. So I just
don't think about it like that. Just think about it as you and I were just talking and having fun.
Yeah.
Having a good conversation.
Yeah. Even though we're like two little astronauts on the opposite side of a table, but
I don't know.
All right.
Well, hey, everyone. Welcome to the Biographers. For anybody that is a consistent listener, you're probably hearing a new voice. And as we kind of warned you last time at the end of the last episode of Abigail Adams, Aubrey is taking a little hiatus. So in place, we have one of my best friends, Akiva Miola. Say hey, Akiva.
Hey, guys. I'm really, really excited to be on here. I have been a huge fan of Biographers even since, Daniel was one of my students a long time ago. I'm so stoked to hear about this new guy. I heard the little intro for our next character, and I am very, very excited.
I'm excited too. And for anybody that is curious, when Akiva says student, you've probably actually heard me mention Akiva in the past because Akiva started out as my blacksmith, knife making, bladesmith, I guess you should say, instructor. A very talented bladesmith, and I've plugged him many, many a times. Go to his website, Metalwork by Miola. Grab some knives there. We actually have a promo code for that too. Mm-hmm. Use Biographers as a checkout code there, and you're going to get 10% off your order. If you're lucky, I might even help him out in making one of those knives, but probably not because he's much better than me.
We'll do a little collaboration. Maybe we'll have you do a handle design or something like that. I think that could be fun.
Sure, man. I
would love to do something maybe history based. Totally. I'll have some new knives up on the website here soon, but most of the stuff that I'm selling are going to other stores. Which I'm sure we can add some info on that too. But
totally.
Feel free to use Biographers to get a discount code, and maybe we'll add some more history-based knives in the future. That'll be fun.
Be super sweet. It'd be crazy if we were able to figure out a way to do knives that were related to the figures that we're studying somehow. So yeah, I think that'd be super, super sweet.
Yeah, we got some antique wrought iron. Maybe we could throw that in there. That'd be fun.
Ooh. Now we're just getting nerdy on blade talk.
Yeah.
Now it's just going to get so dorky for everybody that doesn't know anything about blacksmithing. They're going to be like, what is this?
Yeah. I'm one of these days, I'm going to have to find somebody who made swords who has enough information for a Biographers episode. We'll see.
I feel like there's got to be a good sword maker, bladesmith, or even just blade master. I think you were telling me about somebody. We won't give it away necessarily on who you were kind of thinking about. But for anybody that is curious, Akiva's going to be taking over for the indefinite future, if not for all time. So expect him to be working on a series, which he already is doing right now. I'm very excited. I know who he's working on. This is a little bit of a change, I know, for everybody that, again, is a longtime listener of the show. But I'm very, very excited, and I think this is going to be a good time.
As am I.
All right, man. Well, are you ready to get into part one of our series here, our new series?
Absolutely. I am so stoked. I've been listening to you, do some of the research on this guy, and it seems like a bit of a crazy character.
It's going to be a really good time. I'm very excited to share this information with you. All right. So for our next series, we're getting a little more rootin' and tootin', headed to the rural backwoods of the Appalachian Mountains, which, as you might imagine, means we're talking moonshine. If we're talking about moonshine in America, we're probably going to be talking about American whiskey. If we're talking about American whiskey, we're probably going to be talking about bourbon. And if we're talking about bourbon, there's probably only a few names that are going to come to mind. For this series, we'll be talking about a man who many of you probably didn't even know was a real person, as his status over time has been elevated from humble distiller to whiskey magnate and eventually legend. A man who, despite being born into the poorest of circumstances and with little economic prospect around him, rose up from the mist of the Tennessee backcountry and built a business that would later become a global empire. You might only know his old number 7 when you're ordering at the bar, as he's a big fan of being mixed with Coca-Cola. True connoisseurs will have him served neat. Whether it's an old-fashioned or a Manhattan, hang on to your livers, kids, because we're talking about American moonshiner and Tennessee whiskey maker, Jack Daniel.
All right. I'm so stoked.
Now, before we begin on anything, I'll warn all of you pronunciation police up front. I'm going to try my best to use the Appalachian pronunciation, as I do feel it's closest to the origins of the word. The region was named after the Appalachia tribe that used to inhabit parts of Florida, and the actual correct way to pronounce that tribe's name is Appalachia. Okay? I was able to find a phonetic alphabet from the University of Florida, that broke down each letter and sound from the Appalachia tribe. However, with all that being said, from what I understand, there truly is no perfectly correct way to pronounce Appalachia, as it changes from region to region. From what I gather, the core, quote unquote, of Appalachia uses the Latch pronunciation, while more of the outlying regions use that Lay, Appalachia pronunciation. The territory itself, Appalachia, isn't even fully agreed upon. In one book I found called Appalachians All by Mark T. Banker, there's a map referenced that was created by the University of Tennessee in 2006 that shows the boundaries of Appalachia reaching all the way up to lower New York State and all the way down to northeastern Mississippi.
Wow, New York State, really?
Lower New York State. So undoubtedly, variations in pronunciation are going to exist.
Yeah. So my just some background. My family, my grandfather was raised, half German, half Appalachian. We were always, taught with the sort of Appalachian nomenclature, but yeah, I have heard Appalachian from folks in the area. So I've always been a little bit curious that there was I guess it makes sense. A lot of the names that we have here in the U.S. are native names, and a lot of the times, my dad did his dissertation on language loss with Native Americans. And
really?
Yeah. I got to spend some time with Arapaho folks when I was a kid, and I would go over to some of the reservations and stuff like that. And my dad's from Cuba, and he's like 40% Taino, which is pretty unheard of. Taino Indians didn't really have a super long track record in Cuba after the Spanish came, unfortunately. But he was really fascinated by sort of language loss and stuff like that. And there's just so many languages that have very little written context, or really just like recorded context translated into English. So a lot of those pronunciations are sort of lost to us. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I was honestly, when I started to get into this, I was like, okay, I know somebody's going to get mad at me on how I'm pronouncing this. So I really want to get as close to the origin of this as I can. So again, I feel like Appalachia is the most correct way to say it. So,
yeah.
But again, that's not to discredit anybody that lives, again, in sort of like the outlying regions where they're saying, no, we say Appalachia. So I'm just trying to give credit where it can be given. Now, as always, before we actually begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the primary source used in this series, which is a book called Blood and Whiskey, The Life and Times of Jack Daniel by author Peter Crass. Now, I just have to say on a personal note, I really loved reading this book. It just flowed through my brain in such an easy and digestible way, especially compared to other biographies I have read. So if you want even more detail than what I will provide in this series, I'd highly recommend picking up a copy of Peter Crass's book, Blood and Whiskey, The Life and Times of Jack Daniel. I also want to give a specific thank you to Clint Summers, who is a bourbon expert and helped me to understand more about the history of bourbon in America, and specifically with understanding all of the classifications of American whiskey that there are. My brother Luke put me in contact with Clint, so thank you, Luke. I also have to give a big shout out to my Aunt Carol, who is the person that made me aware of Jack Daniel being a real person. My Aunt Carol is amazing and has been one of my biggest cheerleaders on this podcast since day one. I even have a voicemail saved from her that I got in the early days of this podcast that I want to play for all of you now.
Hey, Daniel, it is your Aunt CJ, Aunt Carol, whatever y'all call me anyway. Your mom told me about your podcast, so I started listening to it this morning, and I've only gotten halfway through the first episode or whatever. Oh my God, dude, it is friggin' awesome. Just need to give you the accolades on that. I am dying on some of the stuff you're talking about. The banter, the casual vibe, I mean, the whole deal. Love it. And I mean, you could take a character like that and just make it so interesting. Anyway, I just want to give you a pat on the back for that. And thinking about you all the time. Love you. And keep up the good work. Talk to you later. Bye.
Isn't that the sweetest thing ever?
That is so sweet. Go, Carol.
I know. I love Carol.
What a sweetheart.
She's the best. So yeah, that was like honestly like a month into us launching of last year. And I've kept it this entire time because it's like made me feel so good.
That is so good. And she's the one who brought Jack Daniels to your attention.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was going to say is that I bring her up because she's a badass. She was on a motorcycle trip across America and while in Tennessee stopped off at the Jack Daniels distillery and basically said, dude, did you know Jack Daniel is a real person? You should do a series on him. So
hell yeah.
Thank you, Aunt Carol.
So cool.
I love you.
I honestly didn't know that Jack Daniels is a real person either.
I didn't either.
It's funny how, despite the fact that it's literally the name of the guy who started this place, Jack Daniels, the whether it be the advertisement or just the sort of word of mouth vibe that you get from whiskey in America, he has become sort of like a mythical character.
Exactly.
I put him up with like,
Johnny Appleseed.
Johnny Appleseed. That's what I was going to say. Johnny Appleseed.
It's like you're like, oh, he's not real. But Paul Bunyan, I do know is a tall tale. But Johnny Appleseed is real. He's a real guy.
Yes. Yeah. I remember we were talking about that one day when we were both writing. That was really also interesting to know. There's so many characters like that.
Yeah. So anyways, just wanted to give a little shout out to my Aunt Carol and appreciate you giving me the rec on this character. It has been an absolute blast researching him. So without further ado, let's get into the life of Jack Daniel.
All right.
Now, Jasper Newton Daniel, a.k.a. Jack Daniel, was born probably in 1849 in Lynchburg, Tennessee, which is about an hour and a half drive south of Nashville, or about an hour and a half drive northwest of Chattanooga. I say probably on his year of birth, as there is some conflict with the company's official website placing his birth year at 1850. But there is census documentation that proves he was at least born in 1849, if not earlier. Some claim he was born as early as 1846. Now, Jack's ultimate destiny in America was kicked off 2 generations prior with the emigration of his grandparents from Northern Ireland. So in order to tell Jack's tale properly, we need to first start by going back a ways. So back in 1641, Northern Ireland started a rebellion against the English crown due to the crown's suppression of Northern Ireland's Catholic faith. Now, upon squashing the rebellion, the English dispatched a bunch of Scottish lords to Northern Ireland to basically oversee and control everything in order to keep the Irish people in line, but under the condition that the new lords push lots of current Scottish residents to Northern Ireland as well.
Ooh.
The idea here was to basically water down the quote-unquote true Irish and make them more Scottish.
Oh, that's great.
Great, right?
That's lovely. That's a very British way of handling things. We'll just water them down a little bit.
Pretty much, right? Now, the crown told the Scots that if peace was kept, they'd all be relatively left alone, free to do what they like. Free being a big word there. Okay. Now, this semi-forced merging of 2 different ethnic groups led to a new group that we now refer to as the Scots-Irish, the Ulster Scots, or most popularly, the Scotch-Irish.
Yeah, that would be sort of where my grandfather was in Tennessee as well, and that probably is generally the sort of ethnicity that most people on my mom's side are.
A lot of Americans will identify as Scotch-Irish, and if you didn't know how that term came to be, this is how. The English technically made it. They forced it to be a thing.
That's great.
Which is pretty funny. Now, Scottish people will tell you that this merger is how the Irish learned how to make whiskey, but the Irish people will tell you that this event is how the Scottish learned how to make whiskey. Like most of these types of arguments, I'm willing to bet it was a mutual evolution, as there is loads of evidence showing that whiskey was made in both places for hundreds of years prior.
Yeah, I'd be a little surprised to hear that Ireland didn't figure out how to make booze. I remember I took a mythology class in college, and Obviously all these mythology stories have tons of different ways of telling them. But I remember one of the funniest things from that is in one of the origin stories that I read, the gods created booze and beer before they created land. Like, I'm pretty sure
Makes sense to me.
It was either land or the sun. It was like they made the land and then they made booze and then they made either the thing that we breathe or the things that we see. Which I thought that Ireland has always had their priorities straight in that way.
And from what I understand as well, if you really press the Scottish on it, the general sentiment is the Irish may have invented it, but we perfected it. So I would be willing to bet the Irish would say the same, but that is a pretty traditional Scottish kind of saying when it comes to whiskeys.
Yeah, and like growing up Latin American, it's the same thing with rum. If you go to any Latin American country, everywhere, they're going to say that their rum is better. My mom's from Venezuela, and they Pampero and all that stuff is like, that's the rum you have to have. And then my dad's from Cuba, and he's like, oh no, that stuff is crap. You can't have that. It's terrible. It's just always how it is.
Well, regardless of who invented it, you now had a new ethnic group in Northern Ireland who had a deep shared love for both freedom and whiskey. But as history has often taught us, the English Empire were historically kind of bastards. And between the 1750s and 1770s, new taxes doubled the rent on Scottish-Irish land throughout Northern Ireland. Possibly even more egregiously, taxes on whiskey had been steadily rising too. This was simply all too much for the Scotch-Irish, many of whom soon decided to up and leave for the New World, America. Between 1750 and 1812, more than 300,000 Scotch-Irish came to America, soon to become the United States, with the most popular ports of entry being Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, or one of several small ports in the Carolinas. Now, a larger portion opted for the Carolinas over Pennsylvania, as it seemingly offered access to more available and homesteadable farmland. Among this mass of Scotch-Irish people immigrating to America were Jack Daniel's grandfather, Joseph Daniel, who went by Job, along with his wife, Elizabeth. Now, Joseph Daniel was originally from Wales. Yay! Which my in-laws are all from Wales. Got to give a shout out to Wales. So super cool. But had fallen in love with the Scottish Elizabeth Calloway. And together they had moved to Northern Ireland.
I wonder, was that a faux pas at sort of that point? I know that there was a lot of sort of prejudice towards
I don't think between the Scottish and the Welsh, I would say the English were. There are if you don't know this, there are 4 countries in the United Kingdom. There's England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Those are all independent nations technically, but all under the same technical constitution.
Yeah.
But really, it's been, from my understanding, the English have been the general baddies.
Yeah.
Right?
Of course.
The Welsh and the Scottish are kind of like the outliers going, screw the English, we're going to do our own thing or whatever. So I would imagine that there probably wasn't much prejudice between the Welsh and the Scottish, which is what led Job and Elizabeth to marry.
They're both sitting at their own table, like making fun of that guy at the bar who's just like being a total dick to the bartender.
Exactly. Now, after getting fed up with the English taxes, like everyone else, probably around 1772, Joseph and Elizabeth Daniel would arrive in New Bern, North Carolina, which was then the capital of the territory. It wouldn't officially become a state until 1789. Now, not long had the Daniel family set up camp in North Carolina before the American Revolution broke out. Joseph Daniel, along with droves of other Scotch-Irish, already had a strong hatred for the English crown and took no convincing to enlist for the colonies and defend their new home. General George Washington himself was so keenly aware of the demographics of his troops that he wrote to the Continental Congress in 1777 saying, quote, "I would beg leave to suggest the propriety of erecting public distilleries in different states. The benefits arising from the moderate use of liquor have been experienced in all armies and are not to be disputed."
Yeah.
Basically, a drunk army is a brave army.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You're not gonna separate America from its booze anytime soon.
Exactly. And to note, daily whiskey rations were adopted at Washington's request and would not be officially abolished in the U.S. military until 1830. So it was in place for close to 50 years, which is pretty crazy.
Those guys in 1830, bunch of narcs.
Quick side note. It's also kind of funny that George Washington was so keen on distilleries that in 1791, Alexander Hamilton proposed a measure to pay for the debt owed from the Revolution by dramatically increasing taxes on whiskey. The result of that is what history now calls the Whiskey Rebellion, where distilleries around the colonies rebelled against the taxes. By 1794, Washington was ordering 10,000 militia members to comb through Pennsylvania to squash the heart of the rebellion.
Well, I mean, it kind of makes sense. A lot of these people who are doing the distilleries have already had a history of overtaxation in their homelands and have moved to the U.S. for that freedom. So that kind of was a bit of a slippery move on Hamilton's part.
Totally. And it's also very unfair because Hamilton was basically saying, well, they don't need all that extra money. They're making all the money hand over fist. Let's just tax the hell out of them and take a bunch of their money to pay for our revolution. And Washington basically was like, nah, we can't really do that. So whiskey tax was not raised to that extent. But anyhow, that's a totally different story for a different day. Now, Joseph Daniel, along with his Scotch-Irish countrymen, fought bravely in the American Revolution, being noted for their incredible marksmanship and rugged brutality. Joseph was discharged from the army not long before the war was officially over in 1783, and eventually, the Daniel family would leave the port town of New Bern, North Carolina, and head for the Cumberland Gap.
Ooh.
Now, if you were born and raised in the United States, your ears probably just twitched when I said the Cumberland Gap because it's very often a section covered in early elementary school social studies, which is what we call it over here. The Cumberland Gap is a passageway in the Appalachian Mountains that comes to a tri-point, allowing passage down through Virginia and into Kentucky and Tennessee. In 1775, wilderness man Daniel Boone was hired to expand the trail in order to allow easier passage, and that trail was later expanded even further to allow for easy wagon passage. In 1796, Tennessee was granted statehood, so Job and the Daniel family decided to pack up, use the newly expanded Cumberland Gap, and try to stake out some land for themselves. Now, something important to remember. Just because the Cumberland Gap had been expanded only a few years earlier doesn't mean that early settlers hadn't already claimed the easily farmable land of the area. Quite the contrary. When most of the Scotch-Irish got to the area, they found that the only land left available was the harsh, inhospitable, sloped forests of the Appalachian Mountains. But also remember where this group of immigrants came from and what their lives had previously been like in Northern Ireland under the oppression of the English crown.
Yep.
These were a hardened people that had already grown accustomed to cold, wet, and unforgiving land. On top of this, as I said a few minutes ago, these were people who, just as much as they valued their whiskey, valued freedom. So when the Scotch-Irish started to settle in the Appalachians, they took ownership of the rugged mountains that were left, because they would rather own their own land and be free than have to pay rent again like they did in Northern Ireland.
It's better to be the head of a chicken than the tail of a bull sometimes. Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah, in Appalachia, that's still such a strong value of just like, leave me alone. That's all I want is to be left alone with my people and don't bother me.
We don't need much. We just need a roof over our heads.
Exactly.
We need our whiskey in our bellies. We need some food to eat and freedom to run around through the woods and have a good time.
Exactly.
Like that's pretty much feels true to this day.
Yeah, 100%.
But regardless, this was still a harsh land they were now settling into, and they needed to adapt fast. First and foremost, they needed food. A massive key to their success in those mountains was in learning to cultivate and grow corn. Now, corn is an ancient vegetable native to the Americas that various Native American nations have been cultivating for thousands of years. So when European settlers arrived, it was quickly adopted as a regularly farmed vegetable. Corn has no problem competing with other vegetation when planted, and its roots are hardy enough to cling onto the steep slopes. So it was all the more perfect for the Scotch-Irish immigrants trying to farm on the overgrown mountainsides. So it's no surprise that when Joseph and Elizabeth Daniel settled in the area, they too began to farm corn. Now, as the new residents of the Appalachians began to settle in, more boxes were being ticked off. They could handle the weather and terrain, they had houses built, they had food to eat, and they had water to drink. However, again going back to freedom, it had to go hand in hand with whiskey. But there was a problem. Barley. Barley is the grain used in Ireland and Scotland as the basis for making whiskey, but it's a type of wheat and needs flat, open fields to thrive. Not exactly the type of land they had available anymore. But luckily for all of them, corn is fairly rich in sugars, and the Scotch-Irish soon discovered that it could be used to make their precious spirit. Before you knew it, the hills of the Appalachian Mountains were riddled with newly built distilleries founded by Scotch-Irish immigrants who had carried their brewing and distilling wisdom with them all the way to the New World. Now, Joseph and his wife Elizabeth, or Betty for short, ended up settling down in the rural countryside of Franklin County, Tennessee, among many other Scotch-Irish immigrants. Job and Betty were prolific child makers, producing at least 11 children that we know of.
Oh my goodness.
Including Isaac, Robert, Annie, Reuben, Abner, Mary, John, William Jeremiah, William Mack, and Callaway.
I feel bad for all the Williams. They're just like, we ran out of ideas. You guys just have to be the Wills.
I'm the most confused where you've got John and William John, because that second one, you can't.
What are you going to call him, William or John?
You can't
because
be William
too many
or
Williams.
John, because then you've got you've got a William Jeremiah and William Max. So you would have to say that you have to be the William, and the other one would have to be the Jeremiah, and the other one would have to be the Mac. But
yeah, that reminds me with my family too. On my mom's side, as you know, like I just said, my grandpa Appalachian, but my mom, her mother's from Venezuela, and all of the kids are Pedro or some version of Maria, and then my mom at the very bottom is Darlene. So obviously every time my mom would get called by her mom, she'd go through the whole list of names. My mom would go, Mom, I'm the one at the end, because it'd be Maria Alejandra, Mariela, like all of the same thing. So I bet you with the Daniels family, there's probably about 5 names before they finally got to Jack.
Probably, yeah. And actually, have you ever seen My Big Fat Greek Wedding by chance?
Yeah, 100%.
Okay, you have. So I love the part where he's the father of the whole family is introducing. He's like, you got Nick, Nicky, and I am Gus. All of the Greeks are named Nick.
I think the rule should be you shouldn't have more kids than you can think of names.
That is fair. But anyway, 11 children that we know of. It is possible that they maybe lost 1 or 2 in childbirth, but not that I was really able to find.
Just 1 or 2 at the gas station when they try to load up the van.
Now, Callaway Daniel, who was the father of Jack, was born in 1800 and for most of his life worked as a farmer, mostly focusing on the primary crop of the area, which again was corn. When the time was right, which is about 16 or 17 years old at the time, Callaway got married. Lucinda Cook, an Irish immigrant, was his bride, and like Joseph Daniel before him, Callaway got busy making kids, and they too would have at least 10 children that we know of over the course of 27 years.
Sticking it with the family tradition.
Jasper Daniel, as Jack was first known, was the youngest, with the oldest sibling being Robert, then Louisa, then James, Melinda, Elizabeth, Adeline, Wiley, Lemuel, and then Finetta.
Wow. Also, I think Jasper is such a cool name. I mean, don't get me wrong. Too. Jack Daniels, that seems right on the whiskey bottle. It sounds good, but Jasper's so cool. I would never want anybody to call me Jack if my name was Jasper.
Now, by the time Lucinda was pregnant with Jack, all was going well. Callaway owned several slaves, which for at the time was you were doing well for yourself if you could do that, which helped him tend his now several hundred acres of amassed land and was seen as a leader in the area around their home of Lynchburg.
Wow.
Now, quick aside on the town of Lynchburg, Tennessee, it was only officially incorporated as a town in 1841, about 8 years before Jack was born, and got its name, you guessed it, from the large amount of lynchings that took place there.
I was hoping that was not the reason, but right as you said slaves and then Lynchburg, I was like, I'm doing the math here and this is about to be bad.
Now, on that note, though, Akiva, do you know what the original meaning of the word lynch actually is?
No, I don't.
It meant a trial without law, or mob law.
Okay.
So, while there were many instances of hangings, especially obviously against Black Americans, there were also many instances where lynchings would result in something like tarring and feathering a person. So it was not
so bad.
Again, I'm just saying, a lot of times when people will hear lynch, and now if you like look up in the dictionary, it says hanging somebody. It's pretty blanket statement. But the original idea was that a lynching was, if you're in a land that has no law and somebody goes and murders your neighbor, what are we going to do? Let this guy go? Nah, we're going to go punish him, and we go after him. Kind of a thing. So it was not exclusive to racist acts of hanging people. Yeah. It was technically, again, trial without law, right? Now, Jack Daniel was born probably in 1849, as I said earlier, although there is some conflict regarding the exact year. But regardless, not long after his birth, Jack's mother, Lucinda, passed away. Although we don't know for sure how. It's speculated that she died from complications related to Jack's birth.
Oh, really?
Although Jack would carry the lingering guilt of his mother's death all of his life, his father Calloway never seemed to blame him. And from what I can gather, he was actually a pretty loving and doting father, which is
nice.
Pretty uncommon, I feel like, for the time. Now, Calloway Daniel, by the way, would remarry a woman named Matilda Van Zant just a few years later, and together they would have 3 more children, although one, a boy, would pass away at birth. Undoubtedly sad, but for the time, only 1 out of 13 infants dying at birth was damn near a miracle.
Yeah, I was about to say the odds are crazy. My wife now and we got engaged out in Glenwood Springs, which for some history buffs, that's the burial grounds for Doc Holliday. Supposedly, we don't.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, we don't necessarily know where Doc Holliday was buried because he was a criminal, so they didn't really mark his grave. But there's a hike that you can take up there that shows you all of the different gravestones and possibilities for the area. And I remember my wife fiance at the time was asking, like, why are there so many small graves? And, we were talking about it. And a lot of the times you hear those statistics where they say, oh, back in the day, people only lived to 30. Not necessarily true. If you manage to live past, maybe 15, 16, you probably going to be golden until you're in your 60s, 70s.
A lot of times.
But the problem, and the reason why that statistic is 30 is because,
the infant mortality rate offset the average.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So that's why you have, it was really depressing when we were going up here. I think I had already proposed at the time, so we were in such a good mood, but we were going here and there was just like child graves all the way up this hiking mountain. And we were like, do you want to go get food? I can't think about this right now.
Let's go get a beer instead. Now, for the first 10 years of his life, Jack grew up fairly normal relative to the area, with his father taking him along for work most days to teach him how to tend the land and the animals. Calloway taught Jack good old-fashioned common sense farming, like when Jack later wrote, quote, I learned lessons from my daddy about farming, like, I never seen a garden that throve good unless it was planted in the full moon. Never plant potatoes near onions. Onions will put their eyes out. And always plant peppers when you're good and mad at your wife, and give your gourd seeds a good hard cussing or they won't come up.
It reminds me of like with my family, I can't tell if it's a Jewish or Hispanic superstition. My mom is very superstitious when we were kids, but apparently if you wanted your hair to grow long, you'd have to cut it in the full moon.
Oh,
yes. Otherwise your hair won't grow back fast enough.
That has to be something that 5 generations ago
was about farming.
It was her great-great-great-great-great-grandmother was like, that's what you do. And then every generation since has heard that same tale. Yeah. And so she's like, totally, that's what you do.
Yeah, exactly. like my sister, I can't remember, it was maybe when she was like in middle school or something like that. She wanted her hair to be really, really long. So on the full moon, my grandmother cut her hair. And I was like, if you want it to be longer, shouldn't you just like not cut it?
Shouldn't just let it grow, don't cut it.
That's just how it is.
Now, though we have very little information about Jack's day-to-day upbringing, one thing we know for sure is that Jack always had a personality. From the beginning, he was noted to be kind, quick-witted, friendly, boisterous, and a general good time to be around. Jack's stepmother didn't seem to care, though, and was apparently pretty awful to all of her children, but especially awful to her stepchildren. As legend has it, young Jack was so fed up with life at home that at just 6 years old, he ran away to pursue his dream of making whiskey. Well,
That's actually a little depressing if you think about it. I'm 6 years old. Let's go make alcohol.
Now, that is the fake version that a bad TikToker might tell you, but there is no historical evidence to suggest that this happened. Quite the contrary, as we do have evidence of Jack Daniel going to school for at least a year and living at home until the outbreak of the American Civil War in 1861. So sorry, everyone. Jack Daniel did not run away from home as a little boy to make whiskey.
Well, at least he learned how to read.
We don't know that yet.
Oh.
We'll find out. Now, in April of 1861, the American Civil War had officially begun with the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter, which is a tiny little island off the coast of South Carolina, close to Charleston. By November of 1862, Northern troops were preparing to attack the town of Murfreesboro, which was only 50 miles away from the Daniel family home in Lynchburg.
Ooh.
Despite protestations from their father, Calloway, two of Jack's older brothers, Wiley and Lemuel, enlisted to fight for the Confederacy.
Yikes.
On a personal level, I was very disappointed to read that their commanding officer was named Captain Tazewell Waller Newman.
Ooh.
Which is my last name.
Yikes-a-roni.
I know. I don't think there's any relation there, but it's spelled the same as my last name, and that just bums me out.
Yeah, I was crossing my fingers on that one because I know that Tennessee was a bit of a swing state. There were some people in certain parts of Tennessee that ended up fighting for the North,
Yes.
and then some that fought for the South.
Yes.
But yeah, I was crossing my fingers on which side they were going to go.
It depended.
But when it's 15 miles from your house, maybe the
50, yes.
Or 50. Oh, okay.
But still,
Yeah.
I mean, it's the writing was on the wall. They were like, hey, if
Yes.
they take this town, they're just going to be coming for us, so we might as well enlist and try to fight them off or whatever it is. Now, for Calloway, things were looking dire. All of his girls were of age and married off. His two oldest boys moved to Texas to become ranchers, and his other two boys just ran off to fight in the name of slavery.
Great.
Jack was now the oldest male in the house at 12 years old. There was still his older sister, Finetta, who was 16, so she was like right on the border of getting married, but she was still at home. And his two stepsisters were only 6 and 4, respectively. This meant that Jack's farm duties with his father were now exponentially increasing, and the Daniel family was barely able to scrape by. Now, just as a quick aside, quite a few neighbors in the surrounding area joined up to fight with the Confederacy and were placed under the command of a native Tennessean named Nathan Bedford Forrest. Nathan Bedford Forrest would eventually become a Confederate general and is something of a Tennessee folk hero, blah, blah, blah. But the main thing I want to say about him is that in 1867, he would be elected the first ever Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan.
Oops. Yikes. That's bad.
Akiva, you'll be happy to know he is immortalized and honored in the United States to this day in many forms. Tennessee has 32 separate historical markers in reference to Nathan Bedford Forrest. Selma, Alabama, of all places, put in a monument to him in just 2012.
Wow, that is painfully recent.
Despite attempts to remove it, Tennessee still observes July 13th as Nathan Bedford Forrest Day, and there is still a state park in Tennessee called Nathan Bedford Forrest National Park.
That's great.
If anyone out there is a fan of Old Forester bourbon, you guessed it, it's named in his honor. Yay, America.
Wow.
Oh, and lastly, yes, Nathan Bedford Forrest is indeed the Civil War general that Forrest Gump says his mama named him after because they were related in some way.
Well, at least Forrest turned out a little bit nicer.
Now, as the American Civil War raged its way through the United States, Tennessee residents found themselves the primary target of pillaging and theft from Union soldiers as plans mounted to retake Chattanooga. The Daniel family wasn't immune and found themselves increasingly desperate for basic necessities as the Union troops freely raided their house and crops. Before the war was over, Lemuel Daniel would contract an unspecified illness while in training camp and would die at the age of 18 without ever firing a shot at a Union soldier.
Well,
all's well that ends well.
I guess so. Yeah, there's at least a bit of poetic justice going on there. But man, 18 years old. I mean, I guess thinking about sort of the cultural context and the people that obviously there's we always have to talk about this when it comes to history. You have to see things with a cultural lens. You know, it's so fun to think that you're going to be the Captain America and you're going to see things differently. But when you are never raised around any sort of alternate ideology, and if you are exposed to that alternate ideology, it's considered, bad and stupid and dumb and like all these terrible things. There's really a very slim chance that you're not going to end up on that bad side of history if the bad side of history is your entire social structure.
I totally agree. I'm not trying to defend the Confederacy here, but I totally hear you in that
yeah. Well, it's just,
you have to remember a lot of these folks were complete. They couldn't read and write.
Yeah.
Right. So if your whole world is I farm and somebody's just attacking you, you can imagine you'd probably go, hey, no, I'm going to attack you back. And then there we go.
It's just about cultural literacy. We talked about that a lot. When I was in college, I studied ethnic studies and stuff like that, racial injustice. And it's just the metric is always how culturally literate you are. You don't see people who travel all across the world and see all these different ideologies become quite as bigoted as the person who only knows the people next door.
True. Now, that was Lemuel Daniel. That was one of Jack's older brothers. Mm-hmm. His other older brother, Wiley Daniel, would fight with the Confederacy until the bitter end and would end up living to the ripe old age of 89.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Well, I guess not all that's bad ends bad.
Now, during the winter of 1863, Jack's father, Calloway, caught pneumonia, and by January 21st, 1864, passed away.
How old would that make Jack right now?
About 13, 14, maybe 15, something like that.
That's a rough time because he's pretty much the only capable person on the farm besides his older sister at this point.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
He's
super young. Let's see, where was I? Oh, yeah. In addition to moderate levels of starvation and freezing, Calloway's spark for life had been snuffed out by the desolation caused by the Civil War and seemingly let the sickness take him. And actually, I wrote it down here. Jack was just 15 years old. Given that his stepmother hated him and quickly made plans to remarry, Jack decided to leave home and stay with his neighbors, the Wagoner family. Mm-hmm. Felix Wagoner, who was in his mid-40s, had known Jack since his birth and was so fond of him that he had named his own son Jasper just 6 years earlier in tribute.
That's so cute.
So it's like, that's how much this guy loved Jack Daniel. Now, Felix signed on to be Jack's legal guardian, but having a family of his own to feed, he simply had no room for Jack in the long term. So he was eventually sent to live with a family not far away named the Calls, whose farm was located between Lynchburg and Mulberry along a stretch of river called Lousy Creek. Mm-hmm. I didn't actually write it down here, but a little bit, there's some legend regarding Lousy Creek and how it got its name. Mm-hmm. Basically what happened was, what we think happened, is that when the British were first exploring the area and they saw the river, it was after a recent rain, so it was a really murky stream.
Gotcha.
And the British officer looked at it and said, "What a lousy creek." And
really?
The name's
actually like lousy.
So you have to kind of think about the time. So lousy meant that you had lice. Okay.
Oh.
So eventually,
like nasty. Yeah.
I'm fairly sure that's where the word evolved from, was that, oh, he's lousy. He's gross in general. And then eventually that became lousy. But it is spelled Louse, lousy.
Yeah, a little Schitt's Creek thing going on there.
Exactly. Now, after the American Civil War came to an end in 1865, the patriarch of the Call family, Dan Call, returned to the farm and happily took young Jack under his wing, as Dan Call had also been orphaned as a young boy. Additionally, Dan immediately took to the kind and affable nature that Jack exuded, a trait that became Jack's signature. Oh, and as a completely random but amazing little factoid, right around this time in 1864, the Welsh Football Club in Wrexham was founded. And yes, I'm a bandwagon fan.
Of course you are. That seems right for you.
It's on brand for me. Now,
I need to watch some of that.
It's adorable. And I've been watching the actual matches. They just got promoted again. It's really, really fun. So anyhow. Now, Dan Call, who effectively became Jack's new father figure, had a lot going on. He farmed his land, he owned a general store, he was a preacher at the local Lutheran church, and was also the father of 18 children with
So-
his wife.
Basically, he just built a town and then populated it.
Pretty much. Now, he was also a slave owner, but to note, he was apparently such a decent person that after the war was over, the 2 or 3 slaves he owned decided to stay on his farm as paid workers. Jack got busy doing any chore that Dan Call asked, from feeding the livestock to building fences, and in return, Jack received a place to stay, a hot meal, and a modest pay.
Nice.
When the weather was warm, Jack preferred to sleep out in the hay lofts of the old barn, drifting to sleep to the sounds of lightly rustling trees and chirping insects. But when he wasn't relaxing in the cozy lofts of an Appalachian barn, he was learning. See, Dan Call wasn't just a farmer and general store owner. He was smart. Dan was educated, among the few people in the area that could read and write, and taught his wife and kids to do the same. When Jack arrived, he too would be taught to read and write.
Oh, okay.
So
yeah.
he didn't actually learn to read and write until he was about 15.
Yeah, I was about to say that's going to be a heck of an advantage considering the terrain that he's going to be growing up and competing in.
Now, Dan was also an investor and businessman, and a savvy one too. Because Dan quickly started to see Jack as something of a son of his own, he started to teach him everything he knew. And Jack was a sponge for it, listening intently to all of Dan's lectures on business strategies and sales. Jack was a sponge for everything Dan taught him. That is, except for the farming stuff. He was a fine enough farmer, but given that Jack Daniel was only, wait for it, 5'2",
Wow. Well, I mean, I guess, several years of being one of the only farm carers just doesn't necessarily mean that you're having your fruits and veggies every day. Maybe if you had a couple extra meals, he could have spread it up a little.
But given his height, he knew he didn't have the physical ability to sustain the life of a farmer, so he was much keener to learn the ways of business.
Short king, let's go.
Just like me. Of the various businesses Dan Call had going on, one little side hustle in particular was quickly catching the eye of young Jack: whiskey making.
Ooh.
Now, it's important to remember, at this time in history, what little medical service was available. It was hardly based in science, but one thing pretty much everyone knew and agreed on for sure was that alcohol really seemed to help in keeping wounds from getting infected. So the practice of distilling alcohol wasn't just for having a good time. It genuinely served a medical function in staving off infections and keeping things clean. I mention this because Jack's new mentor, Dan Call, was a far cry from a drunkard. In fact, Dan Call, as I mentioned a second ago, was a local preacher, and as a result believed firmly in moderation when it came to whiskey consumption. Dan Call had a strict rule: no whiskey was allowed to be consumed on the farm or at his general store. But regardless of how Dan Call personally felt about whiskey, he still felt it important to produce it both for himself and the community around him. And like all things Dan Call did, he believed in doing it to the best of his abilities and with conviction. The spirits he produced would not only be delicious to drink, but extremely pure. Throughout Jack's time working on the Call farm, he would often walk past the sunken area of the woods where a shallow creek ran through and where the Call family still was located, commenting loudly to Dan that he sure would like to learn how to do that one day.
Yeah. Well, that's just always how it is.
You gotta drop the hints,
exactly. And well, I think anybody who ever gets good at anything probably had some mentor who did, something similar.
Absolutely.
Talking with finances, I got to meet a knife maker, another knife thing, but Bob Kramer, he managed to sort of blow up as far as the price per knife ended up going, and I got to talk to him, and he was like, well, it's because I was married to somebody who did finance.
Oh wow.
And it's just like there's just so many, anybody that you've ever seen become just a successful magnate or captain of industry had always had help, had always had information.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
Him being able to transfer over to this new family and learn all this new stuff. Super important.
Stars lined up,
Mm-hmm.
So after working the farm for some time and constant pestering from Jack, Dan Call finally gave in and made Jack an apprentice under his master distiller, Nearest Green. Since he knew he wasn't meant for a life of farming, Jack was starting to formulate a plan in his head whereby whiskey making would be his ticket to a successful future. Eventually, Dan Call gave in and let young Jack start learning the art of the still. Though Dan Call was a decent brewer and whiskey maker, he wasn't the primary brewer and distiller on the farm, as he left that job to a true master of the art form, a man affectionately nicknamed Uncle Nearest. I said his name Nearest Green a second ago.
That's also a cool name, Nearest Green.
Technically, his name is Nathan, but we'll get there. Yeah. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Dan Call was, prior to the Civil War ending, a slave owner. Nearest Green, or Uncle Nearest, as everyone called him, was one of Dan Call's slaves who had decided to stay on as an employee of Dan Call's as a free man. History has come to know him as Nearis, Nearis, but his actual name was Nearest, Nearest, but was misspelled in an early census, so history made a mistake. Now, while slavery is obviously bad, Uncle Nearest seemed to be living a fairly happy existence on the Call farm, and after being freed, elected to stay on the farm as an employee, the master brewer. From what I understand, Dan Call and his family were actually decent people, if you don't count the whole "we used to own slaves" thing.
It's a big ask, but with history, you kind of have to do it sometimes.
Right. Hear me out. It's worth mentioning specifically that Dan Call was a Lutheran, and from what I have researched, Lutherans were historically some of the kindest when it came to slave ownership. Again, not condoning any of this. At the very least, Lutherans were known to bring along their slaves with them to church, all worshiping under the same roof. Yes, it was segregated, so it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, but Lutherans were also known to baptize the children of slaves right alongside their own children. So again, not good. When it comes to the world of slave ownership, especially in the South, Dan Call was comparatively not that bad.
And I mean, that's sort of the history, if you ask anybody from Tennessee, is if there's a level of deference, it is still a Southern state, and there are still very Southern ideals, and historically, obviously, very Southern ideals, as we know from the Daniels family, but there is somewhat of a level of deference, which, like you said, you have to take a historical lens on this.
You do. So just to paint some imagery of Dan Call.
And at least this guy's getting a paycheck now, that type of thing.
He is, and we're going to talk a little about this right here. Now, that being said, it is also worth noting that during the Civil War, Dan Call did ride in the company of Nathan Bedford Forrest, the Confederate general who we mentioned just a minute ago, who did become the first ever Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah.
Complicated situation, I know. Now, when Jack was allowed to come on as his apprentice, Dan Call made it clear that Uncle Nearest was in charge, and that if Jack didn't like it, he could leave. Supposedly, when Dan Call first placed Jack as an apprentice under Uncle Nearest, Dan said to Jack, "Uncle Nearest is the best whiskey maker that I know of." Then turned to Nearest and said, "I want Jack to become the world's best whiskey distiller, if he wants to be. You help me teach him."
Ooh.
Pretty cool.
Yeah.
This wasn't a problem for Jack at all, and over the next few years, Jack dedicated himself to learning everything he possibly could from the seasoned Uncle Nearest. From Nearest, Jack would learn all the secrets of the sour mash craft and the method for purifying whiskey known as the Lincoln County process. And that's where we'll pick back up for part 2 of Jack Daniel.
I am so excited. This is just a really interesting character because, like I said, it's something that you pass by every day, as an adult in America.
Totally.
And I don't think I've ever actually considered whether or not Jack Daniel was a real person.
Same. And I'll be honest, I didn't really put this as a thing at the very, very beginning. I am not being endorsed by the Jack Daniel Distillery at all. This has nothing to do with them. This is literally just me thinking this is an interesting story and kind of going with it. Just wanted to let everybody know. So hopefully you're enjoying so far.
Yeah. No, I'm really curious also. I wonder if we'll get into anything about sort of the different recipes and what Jack Daniel's tastes like now versus in the future. Personally, I'm a huge fan of Colorado whiskey, that type of thing. Yeah. But
and we will get into some of that stuff. We'll see. I know it feels sort of short by comparison, right? Because like the other episodes are so long or whatever. But yeah, this is just gonna be the hour one.
No, I think the hour one is good. For me, like I listen to podcasts for 8 hours, in a row because I am at the grinder and I'm at the forge and I'm always wearing hearing protection, and my hearing protection has, headphones in it. But for the commuters, I feel like the 1 hour episodes are going to be good. And folks, tell me what you guys think about the new 1 hour episodes. I think it'll be really interesting.
Yeah, I'm very curious to know as well. I had to step away to look at my computer really quick to make sure that I had written everything that I had wanted to write. So if there was a weird pause there, I do apologize. But yeah, as we kind of said in the last episode, we're switching formats a little bit. These are going to be an hour long, and they're going to be released once a week instead of 2 hours long every 2 weeks. So in theory, it should be the exact same amount of content, but just given to you weekly in kind of smaller, more digestible chunks. I personally have always been the person that's just kind of gone, man, why does it matter? Just pause in the middle and blah, 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 blah. But we have gotten feedback from quite a few people that say, hey, by the time I get to work, I'm not even close to being done. And then stopping and then starting again or whatever is just, it's weird for my brain. And so, I feel like at the very least, it might even help get our numbers up a little bit.
Yeah, also just having a notification every once in a while saying, hey, Biographer's got something new for you.
Right.
I personally, I think nowadays we don't remember this as much, but I'm still from the generation of like, oh, this show is on Wednesday, and having that release date is like, I don't know, that plants a seed in the mind.
So yeah, if this felt like I was just getting cooking here and I stopped, that's why. But I promise you, we're going to be picking up for part 2 and right where we left off, and it's going to be really, really fun. This is going to be I think I got to a 6-part series, is what I said. Didn't I say that?
Yeah, some 5 or 6.
So it should be 6 parts here. So we should be going for the next month and a half or so. But man, it's a fun story. I promise you guys, there's going to be some information in here that is, if not blow your mind, it's gonna tickle your mind. It's some really, really fun stuff. So I do hope y'all have enjoyed listening. Kiva, how do you feel? Congratulations, you finished your first episode of recording.
I know. I'm excited. Like I said, not microphone shy, but it's still just like wanting to make sure that I have. I think the goal is just, am I asking the questions that I think the rest of the audience would want to ask?
Totally.
That's kind of how I'm framing it, is like being the representative for the other folks on, the other side of the headset.
I think you did fantastic.
Thank
you.
You
did a great job.
I appreciate it.
All right, everyone. I guess the last thing we'll do is we're going to plug your website one more time. Go check out metalworkbymiola.com. You can use the code Biographers at checkout. You're going to get 10% off of your order there, and you're also going to help support my good buddy Akiva here in his knife-making endeavors. And I promise you, everybody, if you go check it out, your mind is going to be blown. It is some seriously beautiful work. I'd even be willing to bet that if you reached out to us at thebiographerspodcast@gmail.com, you might even be able to ask for something custom.
Yeah.
That's a negotiation we'll have to get into, but shoot us an email if you need to. And actually, I forget to say this in so many episodes, corrections, comments, concerns, please email us. I'm not pretending to be an ultimate authority on everything. So if I said something incorrect that you know to be true, send me the information.
Yeah.
I want to know. Thebiographerspodcast@gmail.com.
Yeah.
But what were you going to say? Custom work. I apologize.
Yeah, no, I was just saying for any custom work, I books are open for right now. And now that I'm on the podcast, if there's anything particularly interesting, I'll, let you guys know when something new drops. But yeah, be nitpicky. Send us an email if there's anything. I'm really excited to see where this goes. Jack Daniel is just one of those characters that I was surprised how much information you managed to find on him. So
a lot of information, actually. And obviously a ton of credit has to go to, again, Peter Crass's book. But like all series that we do here, I do massive amounts of research outside of that just to confirm things, double check things, expand on ideas that weren't expanded upon. So we do hope to get you as much accurate information as we can. But again, I am not technically a true scholar on any one of these people. I'm just doing my best here. So again, any corrections or anything, please let us know. Anything else, my friend?
Oh, man.
Cool.
Feeling good.
Me too. All right. Well, thanks everybody for listening. And, I'm gonna say one thing. I've been thinking about this a good bit because I was very much inspired to make this podcast from my history teacher in high school, Mr. Regan. And one thing Mr. Regan said to our whole class quite often was that ignorance is not stupidity, it is the absence of knowledge. So I do hope that everybody here learned something today and did not feel stupid. So anyways, thanks for listening, everybody, and we will see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to The Biographers. For more information, please visit thebiographerspodcast.com.